The morning sun cast a golden hue over the serene landscape of Willow Creek, a quiet neighborhood nestled in the foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains. The air was crisp, the birds chirped melodiously, and the gentle rustling of leaves in the breeze created a symphony of tranquility. It was the kind of morning that made you grateful to be alive. I sat on my deck, sipping a steaming cup of coffee, savoring the peacefulness of my private property. The deck overlooked a sprawling meadow, bordered by a dense forest that seemed to stretch endlessly. It was my sanctuary, my escape from the chaos of the world. But peace, as I would soon learn, is a fragile thing. Just as I leaned back in my chair, ready to take another sip of my coffee, a sharp, authoritative voice shattered the calm. "Excuse me, what do you think you're doing here?" I turned my head, startled, to see a woman standing in my backyard as if she owned the place. She was in her late 40s, with a short, aggressively styled haircut, oversized sunglasses perched on her nose, and an expression that radiated pure entitlement. Her arms were crossed, and she was glaring at me like I was the intruder. "Can I help you?" I asked, keeping my tone polite but firm. "This land is for everyone," she snapped, her voice dripping with condescension. "You're not allowed to just sit here and act like you own the place." I blinked, trying to process her audacity. "I do own this place. This is private property." She scoffed, placing her hands on her hips. "That's impossible. I've lived in this neighborhood for years, and this has always been open land. No one can just buy it." I stood up, setting my coffee cup down on the railing. "Actually, I did buy it. I have the deed, the paperwork, everything. If you want proof, I can show you. But you are trespassing right now, and I need you to leave." The woman, let's call her Margaret, didn't budge. In fact, she stepped closer, her eyes narrowing. "I don't believe you. People like you come in here thinking you can just take what's always been part of the community. I've walked here every morning for years. You can't stop me." I exhaled sharply, already feeling the headache forming. "That's not how private property works. There are signs clearly stating no trespassing. You must have seen them." "I don't care about your little signs," she snapped. "You can't tell me what to do." Her confidence was absurd. I had dealt with rude neighbors before, but this was a whole new level of entitlement. I took a deep breath, deciding to try one last time to be reasonable. "Listen, I don't want any trouble. I'm just asking you to respect my property and leave." She crossed her arms. "And what if I don't?" I stared at her, momentarily stunned. Did she really just challenge me on my own land? I could feel my patience wearing thin. "Then I'll have to call the police," I said plainly. At this, her eyes widened, and for a second, I thought she would back down. But instead, she did something that made my jaw drop. She pulled out her phone and started dialing. "I'll call them first," she declared, pressing the phone to her ear. I almost laughed at the absurdity of the situation. Here I was, on my own legally owned land, being accused of trespassing by a woman who had no right to be here. "Yes, officer, I need assistance," she began, putting on the performance of a lifetime. "There's a strange man harassing me on public property. He's aggressive and refusing to leave." I shook my head in disbelief. This was next-level delusion. She was describing me as if I were some kind of criminal, completely flipping the situation. I folded my arms and waited, knowing the truth would come out soon enough. As she continued her call, I could hear the smugness in her voice. She truly believed she was in the right. "Yes, please send someone quickly. I don't feel safe." I rolled my eyes. She didn't feel safe? She was the one trespassing on my land, refusing to leave. But there was nothing I could do now except wait for the officer to arrive. Margaret ended the call and smirked at me. "You're in big trouble. The police don't take kindly to people like you harassing residents." I exhaled, forcing myself to stay calm. "You know this is going to backfire on you, right?" She simply chuckled. "We'll see about that." Minutes passed, and I could already hear the sirens approaching. Margaret stood there with her arms crossed, looking way too pleased with herself. I, on the other hand, was irritated beyond belief but remained confident. I had the law on my side, and soon enough, she'd realized just how badly she had messed up. A police cruiser pulled up in front of my property, and an officer stepped out. He looked around before his gaze settled on the two of us. He walked over, adjusting his belt. "What seems to be the problem here?" he asked. Before I could say anything, Margaret stepped forward dramatically. "Officer, Thank goodness you're here. This man is harassing me. He refuses to leave and is claiming this land as his own. The officer turned his eyes toward me, clearly assessing the situation. Sir, is this true? I let out a breath and reached into my pocket. No, officer. This is my property. I have all the documents to prove it. Margaret's expression faltered for just a second, but she quickly regained her composure. He's lying. This land has always been open to the public. He's just some outsider trying to take it from the community. The officer looked between us, his expression unreadable. All right, let's take this one step at a time. Sir, can I see your proof of ownership? Without hesitation, I handed him my documents. Here's the deed. It's all official. Margaret leaned forward, trying to peek at the papers. That could be fake, she spat. The officer took a moment to examine the documents, his eyes scanning the details. He nodded, looking back up at me. Everything seems legitimate. Margaret's face turned red. That doesn't mean anything. Just because he has some papers doesn't mean this land isn't meant for the neighborhood. The officer sighed and turned to her. Ma'am, do you have any proof that this is public property? She blinked rapidly, her mouth opening and closing. Well, no, but everyone knows it. The officer shook his head. That's not how property laws work. If this man owns the land and he's asking you to leave, then you are trespassing. Margaret gasped, stepping back as if he had just slapped her. Excuse me. You heard me, the officer said firmly. You are trespassing. You need to leave now. I could see Margaret's world crumbling before her eyes. She had been so sure of herself, so convinced said that she could bend reality to her will. But now, with an officer telling her she was in the wrong, she was struggling to process it. This is outrageous, she finally shrieked. You're taking his side. I'm enforcing the law, the officer said flatly. Either you leave, or I'll have to take further action. I watched as Margaret stood there, fists clenched, her face twisted in rage. For a moment, I thought she would try to argue more, but something in the officer's tone must have finally reached her. With a loud huff, she spun on her heel and stormed off. This isn't over, she yelled as she stomped away. I shook my head, watching her retreating figure. Somehow, I didn't doubt that. The officer handed my papers back. Sorry about that. Some people just don't understand boundaries. I nodded, pocketing my documents. Yeah, I got that impression. As the officer drove off, I sat back down, picking up my now cold coffee. I had a feeling this wouldn't be the last time I saw Margaret. And if I was right, the real trouble was only just beginning. The officer had barely pulled away when I saw Margaret lingering near the edge of my property, arms crossed, and her phone still in hand. I could see the gears turning in her mind, the frustration dent on her face. She wasn't used to being told no, and I could tell she wasn't about to let this go without a fight. I sighed, bracing myself for whatever nonsense she was about to pull next. She took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and stomped back onto my land as if nothing had happened. I was still sitting on my deck, watching in disbelief as she marched toward me with an expression that could curdle milk. You think you've won, don't you? She sneered. Well, I have news for you. That cop didn't know what he was talking about. I know my rights, and I know this land doesn't belong to you. I set my coffee down, standing up again. Margaret, I'm not going to keep having this conversation with you. The officer already verified my ownership. You need to leave before you get yourself into real trouble. She let out a dramatic laugh, throwing her head back as if I had just told the funniest joke she had ever heard. Oh, please. You think I'm scared of a little warning? That officer was probably on your side. But you know what? I'm going to make sure you regret this. I have connections. I know people. You'll be out of here before you know it. I raised an eyebrow. Connections? Like who? She hesitated for just a fraction of a second, then tossed her hair. The Homeowners Association, for one. They'll be very interested to hear about what you're trying to pull here. I chuckled, shaking my head. Margaret, I'm not even in an HOA. This is private land, not part of any neighborhood association. Her face twitched, but she didn't let up. That doesn't matter. They still have authority over what happens around here. I'll make sure they know you're causing problems. And if that doesn't work, I'll call the city and report you for illegal land use. I crossed my arms, now more amused than annoyed. Illegal land use? You're grasping at straws now. If I were doing anything wrong, that officer would have told me. But sure, go ahead. Call whoever you want. I have nothing to hide." She narrowed her eyes, clearly not expecting me to be so calm about her threats. I could see her frustration growing, and I knew she was about to try something else. Before I could react, she pulled out her phone again and started dialing. I sighed, rubbing my temples. She really wasn't going to stop. I watched as she exaggeratedly paced back and forth, speaking loudly enough for me to hear every word. "Yes, hello? I need to report an aggressive man who is threatening residents and trying to block public access to community land." She shot me a smug look, as if she expected me to crumble at her words. "Yes, he claims he owns it, but I know for a fact that this land has always been open for everyone. He even tried to intimidate me with the police, but I won't be bullied." I watched, unimpressed, as she continued her one-sided performance. I had no idea who she had actually called, but it was clear that she was spinning a dramatic tale to whoever was on the other end. "Uh-huh. Yes. Oh, I see. Well, I'll be waiting right here." She hung up and grinned at me. "You're in for it now." I sighed, already exhausted. "Who did you even call this time?" "The police again," she said smugly. But this time, I made sure they understood what's really going on. I rubbed my forehead. "Margaret, you just called the police on me 20 minutes ago. The same officer is probably going to show up." She looked momentarily unsure, but quickly recovered. "We'll see. Maybe this time, they'll actually do something about you." I rolled my eyes and went back to my deck chair, deciding to let the situation play out. There was no reasoning with her, and at this point, I was just waiting for the moment when she finally embarrassed herself beyond recovery. It didn't take long before the same police cruiser pulled up again. The same officer stepped out, his expression a mix of confusion and irritation. He looked between Margaret and me, shaking his head as he approached. "Ma'am, you called us again?" he asked, clearly exasperated. Margaret immediately launched into her performance. "Officer, I had to. He's still here, and he's still refusing to leave. He's getting more aggressive, and I don't feel safe." The officer pinched the bridge of his nose. "Ma'am, we went through this already. This is his property. He has legal ownership. You are trespassing." Margaret huffed, stomping her foot like a petulant child. "But it's not fair. This land has always been open to everyone." The officer sighed, looking like he wanted to be anywhere but here. "That's not how property laws work. I already told you that. If you continue trespassing, you could face legal consequences." Margaret's eyes widened, her arrogance cracking just a little. "You can't be serious. You're threatening me." "I'm informing you of the law," the officer replied. "If you don't leave, I have no choice but to escalate this further." I watched as Margaret's face twisted into a mixture of rage and panic. She wasn't used to being told no, and now that she was facing actual consequences, she didn't know how to react. "You know what?" she finally spat. "I don't need to deal with this right now, but don't think for a second that this is over." She turned on her heel and stormed off, muttering under her breath about how unfair and ridiculous this all was. The officer exhaled sharply, shaking his head before turning to me. "I'm sorry you have to deal with this," he said. "Some people just don't know when to quit." I nodded. "Yeah, I got that impression. What happens if she comes back?" "If she comes back, call us immediately," the officer said. "If she refuses to leave again, she could be arrested for trespassing." I thanked him, and he nodded before heading back to his cruiser. As he drove off, I let out a deep breath. I knew Margaret wasn't going to give up so easily, but at least now I had a clear path forward. If she tried anything else, she'd be the one in serious trouble. I sat back down, picking up my coffee once again. It had gone cold, but I didn't even care. For now, I had won. But something told me that this was far from over. The next few days were eerily quiet. Margaret's absence from my property was a relief, but it also made me uneasy. People like her didn't just give up. They simmered, plotted, and waited for the perfect moment to strike again. I kept my guard up, double-checking my security cameras and making sure my property was secure. I even installed motion-activated floodlights near the entrance, just in case she decided to sneak back in under the cover of darkness. But Margaret wasn't the type to sneak. She was the type to make a scene. One morning, I woke up to the sound of voices outside. At first, I thought it was the usual chatter of birds, but as I stepped onto my deck, I saw something that made my jaw drop. Margaret was back, and this time, she wasn't alone. She had gathered a small group of people, mostly neighbors I recognized, along with a few strangers who looked like they'd been recruited from the local coffee shop. They were holding signs that read, "Public land for the people," and "Stop the greed." Two men were hammering wooden stakes into the ground, as if they were marking off sections of my property for some kind of protest. I took a deep breath, rubbing the bridge of my nose, before walking toward them. Margaret spotted me and immediately smirked, her arms crossed as she watched me approach. "What the hell is going on here?" I asked, already regretting that I even needed to ask. Margaret grinned, clearly pleased with herself. "We're reclaiming this land for the people. You think you can just take something that was always part of the neighborhood? Think again. The community has spoken, and we're taking a stand." I looked at the people standing behind her. Some of them looked unsure now that they were being confronted. I exhaled sharply, forcing myself to stay calm. "Margaret, you have officially lost it. This is private property. You cannot just set up a protest in my yard." She lifted her chin, defiant as ever. "Oh, but we can. You may have some flimsy paperwork saying you own this land, but we have a moral right to it. And if you try to remove us, well, that would be a real shame, wouldn't it?" I narrowed my eyes. "And why is that?" She smirked, pulling out her phone. "Because we're live streaming right now. Hundreds of people are watching you try to intimidate peaceful protesters. Go ahead, say something rude. Or better yet, try to kick us out. Let's see how the internet reacts to that." I clenched my jaw, realizing exactly what she was doing. She wanted me to react badly, to lose my temper, so she could spin this into some sob story about how she was the VY Tim. I wasn't going to give her that satisfaction. Instead, I pulled out my own phone and started recording. "Great idea, Margaret," I said, keeping my tone even. "Let's document this. Hey, everyone watching, just so you know, these people are trespassing on private property. They have no legal right to be here, and if they don't leave, I'll be calling the police to have them removed." Her smirk faltered for a second, but she recovered quickly. "Oh, please. You think the police are going to do anything? We're exercising our right to protest. If you lay a finger on us, you'll be the one getting arrested." I sighed, shaking my head. "Protesting is legal, sure, but not on private property. You can stand on the sidewalk all you want, but the moment you step onto my land, it's trespassing." She scoffed, rolling her eyes. "Blah, blah, blah. More legal nonsense. The people are standing together against you. What are you going to do? Call the cops again? Waste their time over a peaceful demonstration?" I smirked. "Yeah, actually I am." Before she could say anything else, I dialed the police right in front of her. I made sure to speak clearly so everyone watching her live stream could hear. "Hi. Yes, I'd like to report a group of trespassers on my private property. They're refusing to leave, and they're also illegally constructing something on my land. Could you send someone over?" Margaret's confident expression flickered, and some of the people standing behind her looked uncomfortable. A couple of them even started to step away, clearly realizing they had backed the wrong horse. But Margaret wasn't ready to back down yet. "This is a joke," she muttered, shaking her head. "You think the cops are just going to arrest a bunch of innocent people?" I shrugged. "Not my problem. They'll handle it however they see fit." It didn't take long for the police to arrive, and this time, they sent more than just one officer. 2 patrol cars pulled up, and 3 officers stepped out, scanning the situation with clear disapproval. Margaret immediately went into performance mode, rushing up to them with her hands gesturing wildly. "Officers, thank goodness you're here. This man is trying to kick us off public land, and he's threatening us for peacefully protesting." The lead officer, the same one who had dealt with her the last 2 times, let out a heavy sigh. "Ma'am, we've been over this. This is private property. You are trespassing." Margaret's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. But we have a right to be here. We're standing up for the community." One of the other officers looked at the wooden stakes and markings her group had been hammering into the ground. "And what exactly is all this?" Margaret hesitated for a split second before recovering. "We're just reclaiming the space that was stolen from the neighborhood." The officer shook his head. "Ma'am, that's illegal. If you're trying to mark land that doesn't belong to you, that's not just trespassing, that's vandalism and property damage." Margaret's face paled slightly. "That's ridiculous. We're not damaging anything." The officer gestured toward the stakes and markings. "Tampering with someone else's property is illegal, plain and simple. And since this is the third time we've had to deal with this, we have no choice but to escalate the matter. I folded my arms, watching with satisfaction as Margaret's confidence finally started to break. What does that mean? She asked, her voice less sure than before. It means, the officer said, that if you don't leave immediately, you'll be facing charges for trespassing and property damage. Some of the people standing behind Margaret looked outright panicked now. A few of them quickly muttered excuses and walked away, clearly wanting no part of this. Margaret, however, was still standing her ground, shaking her head in disbelief. "You can't do this," she whispered. "This isn't fair." "Fair has nothing to do with it," the officer replied. "This is the law. Now, are you going to leave peacefully, or do we need to take further action?" Margaret looked around, realizing she was losing support by the second. Her hands clenched into fists, her eyes burning with frustration. But she knew she had no choice. "Fine," she spat. "But you haven't heard the last of this." I smirked. "Oh, I think we have." She shot me a glare that could melt steel before finally stomping away. The remaining officers made sure everyone else left as well, and one of them even helped me remove the wooden stakes and markings they had put up. Before Leah VYing, the lead officer gave me a look. "If she comes back again, press charges immediately. She's clearly not getting the message." I nodded. "Will do. Thanks for handling it." As they drove off, I let out a long breath, finally feeling some relief. Margaret had thrown everything she had at me, and yet she had failed again. But something told me she still wasn't done. She had too much pride to let this go completely. A few days later, I received an official-looking letter in my mailbox. At first glance, it seemed legitimate, but as soon as I read the contents, I knew exactly who was behind it. The letter claimed that I was in violation of multiple homeowners association (HOA) regulations, and that I would need to remove all structures from my land immediately or face heavy fines. The problem was, I wasn't part of an HOA. My land wasn't even within an HOA-managed neighborhood. I held the letter in my hands, shaking my head in disbelief. Margaret had really gone and done it. She had faked an official HOA notice in an attempt to scare me off my own property. It was laughable, but also incredibly illegal. Instead of getting angry, I decided to handle this the right way. If she wanted to play dirty, I was more than happy to let her dig her own grave. The first thing I did was contact the actual city offices to verify that no HOA had any jurisdiction over my land. As expected, they confirmed that there were no restrictions on my property and that the letter was completely fake. I asked if they could send me an official statement confirming this, and they gladly obliged. With that, I had all the proof I needed to take action. Instead of confronting Margaret right away, I decided to let her believe she had won. I wanted her to feel confident in her scheme before I pulled the rug out from under her. Over the next couple of days, I went about my business as usual, pretending to be completely unaware of what she had done. Meanwhile, I filed a report with the local authorities, providing them with the fake HOA letter and the official confirmation that it was fraudulent. The moment they saw it, they took the matter very seriously. Impersonating an HOA and issuing false legal threats was a criminal offense. A few days later, I heard a knock at my door. When I opened it, I was greeted by two officers who were there to follow up on my report. I welcomed them in, showed them all the evidence, and explained the entire situation from the beginning. They listened carefully, taking notes as I walked them through everything Margaret had done, from trespassing to filing false complaints to now forging an official document. By the time I was finished, they were shaking their heads in disbelief. "She really went through all this trouble just because she didn't want to accept that the land isn't public?" one of the officers asked. I nodded. "Yep. She's been trying to get me off my own property since day one." The officer sighed. "Well, she's crossed a serious line this time. We'll handle it from here." I watched as they left, feeling a sense of satisfaction knowing that Margaret was finally going to face real consequences. Sure enough, later that afternoon, I saw a police car parked outside her house. I couldn't hear what was being said, but I could see the moment when reality hit her. One of the officers was holding up the fake HOA letter while she flailed her arms around, clearly trying to argue her way out of it. But there was no arguing this time. They weren't just giving her a warning, they were taking official action. The next thing I knew, they were escorting her to the police car. She was still yelling, her face red with fury, but it didn't matter. She had finally done something that even her entitlement couldn't get her out of. Over the next few days, the neighborhood was buzzing with gossip about Margaret's downfall. Word spread quickly about what she had done, and people who had once tolerated her antics now wanted nothing to do with her. She had embarrassed herself beyond repair, and even the few people who had supported her before were now keeping their distance. A week later, I noticed a MOVYing truck parked outside her house. At first, I thought she might just be getting rid of some things, but as the day went on, it became clear she was MOVYing out. I couldn't help but smile as I watched her carry boxes to her car, her expression bitter and defeated. She had spent so much time trying to get rid of me, and in the end, she was the one who had to leave. As she was loading the last of her things, she caught sight of me standing on my deck. For a moment, she just stared at me, as if trying to find one last thing to say. But there was nothing left. She had lost, and she knew it. With one final huff, she got in her car and drove off, leaving the neighborhood and my property behind for good. With Margaret finally gone, I was able to enjoy my land in peace. No more surprise VY sits, no more fake complaints, no more ridiculous protests. I could finally sit on my deck with my coffee and enjoy the quiet morning without interruption. Looking back, it was almost funny how far she had gone just to fight a battle she was never going to win. She had tried everything from lies to legal threats to outright harassment, and yet, in the end, none of it mattered. The law was the law, and her entitlement couldn't change that. As I watched the sunset from my deck that evening, I couldn't help but chuckle to myself. Maybe, just maybe, Margaret had finally learned her lesson. Or maybe she had just moved on to torment some other poor soul in another neighborhood. Either way, she was no longer my problem. And that, I thought, was the best VY Tory of all. If you were the one in this story, how would you react? Would you stand up and fight back, or accept the unreasonable pressure and control from the HOA? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe, like, and share this VY Deo with more people. Your small action gives us the motivation to keep bringing you more intense and engaging stories. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next VY Deo.